Hi, everybody. Welcome to our next lesson. So, we're on this unit of immigration industrialization, and next we're going to be talking about the growth of labor unions, the rise of labor unions. So, as the economy was changing during the Industrial Revolution, you have workers flooding to these urban areas, as we've been learning. And the opportunities that were brought in by the Industrial Revolution was a major reason for this. Suddenly, now you have these giant factories opening up. You have tremendous opportunities in the oil industry, the steel industry, and workers are going into the city looking for these jobs in cities such as New York and Pittsburgh and Chicago. But with some of these, with that comes some benefits and some negative consequences. So our big question we're really going to look at is like, how did the Industrial Revolution impact workers? And one of the most obvious ways is you have an increase in wages, right? But before we go too much into that, today our objective is we were going to find out you need to be able to explain what unions are, the different types of unions, and why they were created, right? And you're going to be completing a paragraph summary in order to do this. So, as I said, uh, in in fact, workers' wages, did go up during the Industrial Revolution. People are making money, and that's one of the reasons why you have millions of people coming into the United States. Many coming from Europe, immigrants coming in from all over the world. Many people are leaving rural areas, the agricultural areas, and looking for this kind of opportunity to make more money. And with that, though, comes problems. Even though you have this opportunity that's presented by the Industrial Revolution, many people still had trouble supporting a family. In fact, it was very, very common, especially amongst lower income people, where everybody in the house worked, including children. Child labor became really common, and there's a lot of reasons why children are used in this period. They're attractive to employers because they can be exploited more efficiently. They're less likely to cause problems. You could pay them less, right? So child labor becomes extremely common during the Industrial Revolution, and wages were so low. And not only were the wages low, but the conditions were horrible, as you probably should know from our reading yesterday. It was extremely common for there to be no laws with regard to worker safety. It was not unheard of that people would work 6, sometimes even 7 days a week for hours, for like 12 hours. 12 hours was a common amount that would be worked. There was no sick pay, no vacation time, no unemployment insurance. If you were to lose your job, if you were injured on the job, you could, take a look at this individual here in this picture without his arm, this young boy. And you could be injured while working in a factory, and you were without any type of compensation. There was no benefits, right? Those kinds of things that we think of today, unemployment and all that. The safety net that helps people if they get hurt or if they lose their job, that didn't exist during this time. The conditions were hazardous, and a big reason for all of this was the fact that laissez-faire existed, meaning there was no regulation, and with that came little protection for workers. Um, there's actually a figure in our textbook that basically says in 1882, an average of 675 workers were killed in work accidents every week. 675 a week. And so this creates tremendous burdens on individuals within the workplace. And many people began to question the wealth that was being generated during this time. So here you have this very famous political cartoon where these wealthy industrialists are sitting upon these bags of money. You've got people like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller and other industrialists. And meanwhile, while they're reaping the benefits of the wealth, the workers are the ones who are shouldering the burdens, the hard times, the difficult and low wages. Um, they're building this wealth, but yet they're not being compensated appropriately for it. And so, what workers began to do, more so than in previous times, is they begin to organize. And a big part of this period of time is this change in the way work is taking place. Work goes through a huge transformation during in the Industrial Revolution, and work becomes very specialized. The specialization of labor, meaning that workers no longer worked on a product from start to finish. There was this new relationship between the employer and the employee. And some of the ways that work changed was work became recognized. It was very common to see machines in the production process, right? And with that comes low skilled workers, right? They didn't need to be able to make the whole product. So they only needed to do maybe one specialized job. So it didn't require a lot of skills. So a lot of people were low skilled. And one of the things that's going to occur is you're going to see workers who don't need as many skills as they once did. Now, that doesn't mean the job is easy. Of course, the jobs, some of them were very difficult work, and you don't you don't need a lot of skills because you're doing only one aspect of production. In this particular picture, you see here you have workers who are working on the production of a car, I believe, and the electrical belt that is there, it's mechanized, and it'll basically go down the line, and meanwhile the workers will each be doing one component, one phase of the production. So you don't need a lot of skills. You just need to know how to do your part, really, and be able to do it well and quickly. And because you don't need a lot of skills, and because it's very specialized, you could pay low wages. And workers were getting tremendously low wages during this period, and they were easily replaced. So if a worker, let's say you were the employer and a worker was giving you trouble, you could just get rid of them and replace them with someone else. And there's basically a pool of workers available to take the place of those workers that may be too slow. They might be asking for higher wages or things like that. And one of the big parts of this is very strict factory discipline. If for some reason one of these workers is late, is ill, they're sick, is not working fast enough, it is in the employer's interest to speed up production, right? They want to maximize profit. So they would get rid of those workers who they felt were being inefficient. Now, with this, rapid pace becomes very dangerous. Trying to work quickly can be dangerous. So working conditions were extremely dangerous. Think again of that number. 675 people are killed each week. This is just the norm, right? And so this becomes the norm. And so work is changing. Everything is very much about this idea of efficiency, right? And if you take a moment and pause the video and read this excerpt on the right, the quote that I have put here on the screen, it's from a brochure that was given to workers to instill values. And, like, what are those values? Speed, following directions, this type of thing, those values that they wanted to instill in them. So just read through it and you can kind of get a sense of what was expected of workers at the time. Now, the change in the workplace really kind of comes with the assembly line. The assembly line, as we've learned, it's this kind of symbol of the Industrial Revolution. It's efficient, it's fast, it makes things very quickly, mass production, all of these things that we kind of value in business. And the guy who really is the one most responsible, who shows how it's done, is a guy whose name is pretty common, right? It's Henry Ford, as we learned in one of our previous lessons, and he was very efficient in his use of the assembly line in the automobile industry. In fact, it's good to be, Henry Ford using the assembly line in his factories. That's going to allow for mass production of cheap automobiles that the average American family could afford later on into the 1920s. So it does have some benefits, right? And so work is changing. The lives of workers are changing. There's opportunity out there now, but it's coming at a cost, right? So these workers who are kind of being the core of what is building this industrial revolution are looking for ways to improve their working situation. They need to find some sort of a way to equalize the power dynamic between uh, boss and employee, and what that comes in the mass formation of what we call unions, right? And they form unions to try to improve their situation. And unions are basically organizations of workers. They can be national, they can be at a particular company. They basically are a group of workers whose goal is to advocate on the behalf of the entire group. And what we call it when workers negotiate with the employer together, it's called collective bargaining. And that's basically the essence of what the union was all about. It was all about collective bargaining. So rather than just one guy going to his boss and saying, hey, the working conditions are not up to the standards that I feel are necessary, or we should get sick time, or hey, my arm blew off, I need some sort of compensation for getting injured. Instead of having that, just one guy do that, instead the group would work together. The entire group of workers would come together and form a union. Like the Union of Hard Hat Handsome Men, or the United Steel Workers Union, right? So these are the workers, right? And they're looking for an opportunity to make a difference in their lives, wages, hours, those types of things. And it kind of has it's a simple concept, right? The employer is the one with the power. He's the big fish in the pond, as you can see at the top. He's able to exercise full control over the workers. But if the workers find a way to unite, they can somehow equalize things. They could figure out a way to give the workers the power, the voice that they need. So these unions start forming to fight back. And what's important to keep in mind is management, the boss, the employer. They have certain tools or certain things that they could do to exercise their power. And workers, labor, the unions, they have certain tools that they can use to try to get their way. So, for example, for workers, for union members, they could do things like boycotts. If you work for a particular company and you feel that company is not following your wishes or your demands, you could try to organize a boycott. For example, Cesar Chavez during the 1960s, he organized a boycott against the grape industry, not just amongst grape workers, but with the public. Getting people on your side that way. Workers also have other tools like informational picketing, letting the public know what's going on, passing out flyers to the public, staging protests to tell people what's going on. What are the conditions like? What are the demands that you're asking for? Trying to get public opinion on your side. Closed shop is another strategy or tool of labor. Closed shop is basically requiring that all workers at a particular place belong to the union. And that way you can ensure that everybody within a particular company or organization or factory belongs to a union. So that's a goal that workers strive towards. And the most obvious, the most common known tactic of workers is the strike, refusing to work, walking out on the job and trying to shut down production or whatever the job happens to be, to force management to come to the table and bargain with the workers. So these are different strategies that labor has. Now, management has a lot of power too, especially during the period of the Industrial Revolution. For example, first off, they have power, especially during this period. Management has a lot of power. For example, if you were out on strike, one of the tactics of management would be to hire scabs. And scabs are replacement workers. And they got the name scab because back in the day, someone who took the job of a worker who was on strike, they were often the target of a lot of anger. And sometimes they got beat up, they were beat down, and were physically beaten. And they're given scabs, right, to show that they are not a part of the union's cause. So that's how they got that name. So scabs are replacement workers. And Pinkerton Guards was basically a private detection police force that corporations such as Carnegie Steel used. And those guards would spy on workers, and they would use violence to try to break up protests. And so Pinkerton Guards were used back during the Industrial Revolution. And blacklisting, that's another one. Basically, workers that are causing trouble or were trying to form unions, and in many cases, they would be blacklisted. And basically, that meant your name would be circulated amongst a particular industry. For example, if you were a steel worker and if you were trying to form a union, you would be blacklisted, your name would be passed around, and you wouldn't be able to find a job anywhere. You would not be hired by any company. Other examples of power include court injunctions, getting the court to rule against the labor union, forcing the workers back into the factory. So getting the law basically to declare a strike illegal, for example. Those are all examples of court injunctions. And open shop. Open shop is the opposite of closed shop. And it's basically is creating a company in which no unions are allowed. And many employers during the Industrial Revolution really try to keep unions out. And then finally, fear. Getting public opinion to portray the union as being radical, that they're violent, that they're communists or anarchists or socialists, or that they're going to destroy property, or that they're using whatever tactic, right? But getting people to feel that the union is not the one who should be supported. So all of these things are done during the Industrial Revolution to try to gain an upper hand between workers and management. Now, speaking of strikes, there's actually one going on right now in September 2020. Nurses in Chicago are, as you can see in this picture, are going on strike. And the issues are tremendously complex, but it's a perfect example of a union. The SEIU is the union, also called, it's known as the Service Employees International Union. And they're trying to use their influence, the power of the strike, to bring attention to the cause that they are trying to address. And this cause is they're asking for fair pay and better wages in the city of Chicago in the middle of this pandemic, right? And once again, these are issues that get very complicated. But pay attention to what's going on in Chicago right now. What we're learning about in this lesson is directly connected to what's going on out there in the real world. And so what ends up happening is you actually get a series of unions in this time, and there's so many different ones that came into existence during this time. And I'm just going to highlight a couple. And two of the big important ones. The first one that you should know about is the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, and it's created in 1886. And the American Federation of Labor it's an interesting union, and it was founded by a guy named Samuel Gompers. And Samuel Gompers, not only did he have an awesome mustache, as you can see in this picture, extra credit if you can grow a mustache that looks as cool as that. And come on to our class online meeting for a week, and you'll get 5 extra points, extra credit if you can grow a mustache like that. So Samuel Gompers, his union, the American Federation of Labor, focused on issues that were very practical, what they called bread and butter issues. And basically what that meant was they were not going to organize all workers. They were going to organize skilled workers. And this is known as craft unionism. And the American Federation of Labor focused on particular crafts, particular professions. And they focused on the skilled workers, and the reason behind that is real simple. The skilled workers are much more difficult to get rid of. They tend to be a little bit more educated. They tend to be easier to organize for a variety of reasons. And the American Federation of Labor focused on those workers. And there was no attempt to organize the unskilled labor. For the American Federation of Labor, the unskilled workers were difficult because they could be replaced very easily. And that's one of the problems that the labor union movement had at this time, is that they were divided. It wasn't as simple We are the workers, we stand together, solidarity forever. It wasn't as simple as that. It was a divided movement. And so the American Federation of Labor focused on bread and butter issues. That term bread and butter means that they're practical things, things that workers can use, like the 8-hour workday, higher wages, a shorter work week. They weren't really interested in social reforms like child labor or equal pay for men and women. They ignored racial issues. They're much more kind of a bread and butter craft union, skilled workers union, and they were headed by Samuel Gompers. And they're going to participate in a bunch of strikes during this time, but that's just one example of a union forming during this period. Another one was much more radical. And this other more radical labor union took the goals of the American Federation of Labor and upped them a bit. And this one was the Knights of Labor. They were interested in wages and things like that, but they're also interested in fighting the power, basically. And the Knights of Labor had different goals. Yeah, they wanted to, they wanted the shorter work week, they wanted higher wages, they wanted those types of things, but they also called for things such as equal pay for women. Women were paid less even when doing the same profession as men, and many jobs were not open to women back then. And as a result of their calling for reforms on that area, many women joined the Knights of Labor and joined this group as well. They also called for an end to child labor. They wanted cooperative ownership of factories, meaning that workers should share in the ownership of the factories in which they work. Another thing the Knights of Labor did was they wanted African Americans to be allowed to join, except in the South. The South was filled during this period with Jim Crow racism, segregation, right? But in the North, they advocated that Black and white workers should be able to join the same organization. Race is another thing that divided the labor union movement and made it ineffective. Some workers were hostile to different groups of people. One of the interesting members of the Knights of Labor is the woman you see on the slide here. Her name is Mother Jones. She got the nickname Mother Jones. Her real name is Mary Harris Jones. And she's going to be a member of the labor movement. And she's going to be an advocate against child labor. And we're going to learn more about her in another upcoming unit. So you have all these different labor unions. And there's other ones, you can read about in your textbook. I recommend reading about them, like the Industrial Workers of the World, which was headed by William Haywood, who was nicknamed Big Bill. There's a lot of different unions that you can read about. So read about them in your book if you get the chance. And you have other strikes that we're going to talk about in a second that are taking place, and you can read about those too. So I really recommend doing that. So speaking of strikes, in fact, you had a lot of strikes taking place during this time. In fact, between the period 1870 and 1900, every area in pink on this map experienced strikes taking place. Some of them with the red stars that you see on this map, those are areas that had major labor disputes, huge strikes. And the first one takes place in 1877. And what was going on in the 1870s is there was a depression in the country in 1873. Wages were cut, businesses were closing, and workers on various railroads in Baltimore and Ohio were seeing their wages drop. And what they basically begin to do is in 1877, they decide that the wages, continue to drop. And so they start to organize. They start to organize and they start to make decisions that perhaps a strike needed to occur. In fact, over 50,000 miles of railroad track comes to a halt during this strike when they decide to stop working. So the president at the time was Rutherford B. Hayes. So here is actually some images depicting the railroad strike. And like I said, the president at the time was Rutherford B. Hayes, right here. And he decides to intervene. And the interesting thing about his intervention is that it's not on behalf of the strikers. It's not on behalf of the railroad workers. Instead, he decides to interfere and intervene. And he does this by sending in troops. And violence erupts. As you can see, buildings are destroyed. The federal troops are sent in. And as you can see in the top right of this slide, you see the building burning, right? So violence erupts, buildings are destroyed, the troops are sent in. It's a mess, right? In some cases, the workers were to blame. Some of the workers tended to kind of go beyond just striking, and they were being violent and burning and looting buildings. But for the most part, it was really the presence of these federal troops that provoked this. And Rutherford, who is by far, in my opinion, one of the ugliest presidents. His name is Rutherford, first of all. I don't know, his mother had him as a child and for some reason said, I'm going to name this sweet little baby Rutherford. Right. Not that cute of a name. And Rutherford, maybe he would be handsome without the beard, as you can see. But he does a few things besides sending out the federal troops. Yellow Dog contracts are forced on the workers, as you can see. And Yellow Dog contract was basically an agreement placed on a worker, usually because of force, and it said that you as a worker would not join a union, and that you pledge you will not join a union, and that was something that many workers were forced to sign after this event took place. Also, the Pinkerton Guards, those private police force that I mentioned before, they were sent in, and the strike was broken. And what you see happening is, and here's a sketch of some of the railroad cars and some of the depots that were actually on fire. So you see violence is taking place, and it creates a difficult situation because many people in the public blame the workers. Look at these radicals, look at these agitators, look what they're doing. But there's other problems the workers had, and some of those problems were internal problems. For example, there was a lot of challenges facing the labor movement. There was ethnic and racial divisions. Many unions didn't want immigrants to join their union. Many of them felt they were anti-immigrant. They felt that immigrants came in and took low wages, which reduced the amount of jobs that were available to American workers. There were racial divisions. For example, many unions felt that African American workers worked for less and were paid less, so therefore they were a threat to their wages or their job security. There was division between skilled and unskilled workers. The American Federation of Labor didn't really focus on unskilled workers because there's this fear that these unskilled workers are easily replaced, therefore they'd be more difficult to organize. And the biggest challenge by far is the fact that corporations had tremendous resources, tremendous power, and the government had no protections in place for workers. So the unions were basically on their own. There was a laissez-faire attitude. There was no protection. There was no right to join a union. And very often they were broken up. So you get a lot of challenges facing workers. In fact, though, one of the things that occurs, and this is not all workers, but in parts of the West where the Chinese immigrant population was really high, you have anti-Chinese riots. And sometimes it was workers that were a part of these. There was a tension there that the Chinese were coming in and the Chinese were stealing jobs. So as you can see here on this slide, it's a classic political cartoon. You got the white American man on the right standing outside, unemployed, nothing to do. And what's happening over here is the Chinese worker on the left is doing a million different jobs. You can see look at all of his arms, right? He's doing all these different jobs. He's stealing the jobs from the Americans. And therefore, it was labor unions in some cases, not all, but labor unions in some cases that supported in 1882 the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act basically did exactly what it said. It kept out Chinese immigrants from coming into the United States. There were some exceptions. If you were a student, if you were highly educated or something like that, then you can get in still. But even then, it was very difficult. And you can see the Democratic Party right here on this on the left. It says, no more Chinese in quotes. It's a big victory for this particular group. And so labor unions in some cases were supporters of this act, which was keeping out a particular group of people. And it was based upon this idea or this fear that somehow this group was stealing jobs. This group was changing America for the worse. So you have all this stuff happening, right? And you have a couple more strikes, and then we're going to be done with this lesson. So Haymarket is another one of these examples of a bad situation turning even worse. And so Haymarket, what occurred is some police officers, and very often the police acted very violently towards the workers. Some of the police officers ended up killing a group of people on strike. And these workers were killed at a plant. A couple of them had been killed and a couple more wounded at a plant called McCormick Harvester the day before. And what ends up happening is the workers are outraged at this violence towards one of their own. And you have this poster right here, which shows the mass meeting that is called in response. And it's both in English and German, which shows you that the immigrants, they're also working as well as the English speaking workers. And they call this massive protest to take place in Chicago in Haymarket Square. And a massive group of workers show up to protest, 3,000 strong. And when the protest ends on May 4th, 1886, what you have happening is someone tosses a bomb into the crowd, and the bomb leads the police to start shooting. And following the police shooting and the bomb going off, you have 7 police officers killed. You have many workers who are also killed. To this day, we don't know 100% who threw the bomb, but after the Haymarket riot, as it was called, many people in the public blamed the workers. And a group of people are convicted for the deaths of the police officers, a group of workers, some of them with radical associations. 4 of them are hung. 1 commits suicide in prison. And what happens is they're known as the Haymarket Martyrs because many people in the labor movements say they didn't do it. They were unjustly put on trial and wrongly killed and executed. But what happens is many people in the public turn anti-union in response to this. They're like, look at the union, they're radicals, right? Now, what you need to keep in mind is very often the unions, the workers, were scapegoated. It's very easy to say the workers are to blame. And very often the violence in some cases was the result of, workers doing certain things. But very often they were reacting to these Pinkerton guards, these police officers, the government troops, the National Guard being sent out, right? So it's a lot more complicated than just saying it's good guys versus bad guys. Another strike, the third one that you should know about, takes place at Homestead, Pennsylvania in 1892 near Pittsburgh. So in Homestead, Pennsylvania is a steel factory, which was owned by none other than your boy Andrew Carnegie, right, who we learned about. And the workers at Homestead were working in atrocious, horrible conditions, really poor conditions. And Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man, the company president, who was named Henry Clay Frick, decides in 1892 that he is cutting wages. And what ends up happening is that the workers decide, okay, you're going to cut wages. So then they go on strike. And what happens next? The troops are sent out. National Guard is called. And in total, 9 workers are eventually killed during the violence. And eventually the union is busted. The plant returns into operation. And basically it's another defeat for the workers. And the last major strike takes place at an area named Pullman, which is near Chicago, again, as you can see on the map. And this one takes place at a company known as the Pullman Palace Car Company. And basically, this was one of those railroad car companies that specialized in making luxury railroad cars. So these types of cars were the ones where you could ride in style across the city, or I mean, from city to city or across the country. And the Pullman Palace Car Company was one of these places that experienced some problems. There was a depression, workers' wages were cut, and a bunch of workers were laid off. They lost their jobs. But what is unique about Pullman is it was a company town, and basically what that meant was the workers who worked in Pullman by day lived in the town. So there you have the factory where the workers worked. Then the town is where they lived, right? So where they worked is where they lived, and the company owned the town. And this town basically they paid rent to the company they worked for in order to live in this town. So here you can see some images that I've gathered for you. And there's a lot of reasons why, if you're a company, that you like the idea of a company town. And the biggest one is that you can have control over your workers. You can have supervision. You can impose curfews on your workers. You can monitor them. All those types of things are happening. And what ends up happening is they cut wages again, about 25 to 50% cut. But the company doesn't cut the cost of rent for the people living in Pullman, living in the company town. So the workers get fed up. They're fed up with years of being laid off and wage cuts and poor working conditions. So they decide to form a union and go on strike. And the strike is led by the American Railway Union. Here's an image. And the Pullman strike of 1894 takes place, and you have the head of the American Railway Union. And this is a guy whose name you're going to hear about a few times over the next couple months. And this is a guy by the name of Eugene Debs. And he and his union had power. And the power came from the fact that the workers were able to paralyze the railroad industry. The railroad industry was shut down, and Eugene Debs was a fiery speaker, a great public speaker. Actually, you can see in this political cartoon, they're referring to him as King Debs, and in the background of this cartoon, you have railroad depots just kind of sitting with nothing going on, and it kind of represents the power that he and his union had. Now, what ends up happening is Pullman tries to hire some strike breakers, scabs, and the workers try to resist those strike breakers from coming in. And the president at the time is another guy with a horrible name. His name is Grover Cleveland. And he uses the excuse that the mail was not being delivered and says, if it takes the entire Army and Navy to deliver a postal card in Chicago, that card will be delivered. And he basically says, by the workers going on strike, that they're preventing the distribution of the mail. And he uses this as an excuse to send in troops. And the court rules that the workers have to go back to work. And things turned violent, and those workers who were not fired, they were blacklisted, and the strike is crushed. And federal troops, the court's blacklisting, right, is taking place. And even up until 1900, the union membership remained weak. Only about 5% of workers belong to unions. But what you see happening is, even though these defeats are taking place and workers are facing a lot of challenges, they continue to put pressure on companies to address the needs and concerns of workers. But numerous problems remained, right? And so what you're going to see is it's going to take a long, hard fight for this to eventually result in a victory for unions. But in spite of these challenges, they're going to continue to fight. So make sure you finish reading the assignment from yesterday about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in order to really see how bad these working these working conditions and these realities were for workers. So that's it for this lesson. Let me know if you have any questions. Make sure to email me or reach out during class. And good luck on the assignment.